Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicholas Phillips, and thank you so much for joining us today for an awesome program. We're talking immigration reform and whether lessons learned during the last round of reforms can be applied to future debates. For clarification, it's been 30 plus years since Congress enacted a comprehensive set of immigration reforms, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 and the Immigration Act of 1990. These bills passed only after hotly contested debates that spanned 5 presidential administrations, 8 congressional sessions, and painful compromises on both sides. Not to mention that those bills died on the House floor before, of course, being ultimately resurrected in the 11th hour. So we must ask ourselves how pro-immigrant advocates should approach the question of compromise and why they must. How challenging has it been to enact immigration reform over the past 75 years and why? And which new policy innovations have the potential to advance progressive reform? A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We want our conversation today to be as interactive as possible. So please submit your questions in the chat dialog box in the top right corner of the player. I'll be fielding those questions throughout, and I'll be getting those over to our panel. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can. And lastly, if there is anything you missed, this is being recorded, of course, and the recording will be available at the same URL immediately following our conversation. And with that as our baseline, it's my pleasure to introduce our returning champion, Professor Steve Yale-Loehr, who teaches immigration and asylum law here at Cornell. He also serves as counsel at Miller-Meyer here in Ithaca. Next, I'd like to welcome Michelle Hackman, who serves as a reporter for the Amazing Wall Street Journal, where she writes about immigration issues. Michelle, welcome back, and it's always a pleasure to have you. And finally, the reason we're all here, Charles Kamasaki. Charles is a distinguished visiting scholar here at Cornell Law. He is also a senior advisor for Unidos US, the nation's largest Latino civil rights organization. He's also the author of Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. It features a history of how the 1980s era reforms were enacted, along with some of the developments since then, and concludes with 7 lessons that advocates and lawmakers should consider in the future of immigration reform. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Nicholas. Glad to be here. Immigration has got a powerhouse of heavyweights on immigration, including Charles Kamasaki, who's distinguished visiting scholar here at Cornell Law School. So we're delighted to have him here. Cornell is also in the middle of a 3-year migrations initiative in which researchers across Cornell are working on all aspects of migration, whether it's migration of plants or animals or humans or microbes. So looking at migration in this interdisciplinary and interspecies way is allowing us to really come up with new insights into this huge problem. So with that as background, Charles, let's talk about you and your career and your book. So let's start with an easy question, or at least a background question. How did you get involved with immigration issues?
Well, as viewers might surmise, Kamasaki isn't exactly a common name in the Latino circles. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, and my first job out of college was working with small cities. This in the Rio Grande Valley, it's predominantly Latino, about 80% Latino. And I happened to encounter an NCLR affiliate, a National Council of La Raza affiliate, now Unidos US. Through a whole series of accidents, I ended up meeting Raul Luis Aguirre, who was then the president and CEO of NCLR. And a while later, he invited me to join the staff and then later to come to DC. I actually started in DC as a housing policy analyst and was working on those issues. And it, again, one of those happy accidents of life. The guy who was covering immigration at the time, a guy named Francisco Garza, who was our legislative director, got married and decided to relocate to the West Coast. And they were kind of looking around and it's like, who's going to cover the immigration bill? This was 1982. And I guess I said, I guess I will. That began a 4-decade focus on immigration.
Well, you were very involved with the legislative battles over both the 1986 law and the 1990 law. Your book goes through in great detail with summarizing what went on both publicly and behind the scenes. But how did you decide to write the book?
Again, that was a complete accident, Steve. It's sometime many years later, actually. I guess it would have been in the 2010s or so. Several of us who had been involved in the Immigration Reform and Control Act debate got together for a lunch, and as older people will do, we began to reminisce and talk about kind of old battles and what people could learn about the current debate from the past debates, and kind of the idea of writing a book arose. And a guy named Skip Enders, who was the former staff director of the Judiciary Committee, and before that, the Immigration Subcommittee, just kind of out of the blue said, "Charles, you should write the book." And I thought, that had never occurred to me. And then another happy accident. I don't know whether these two are related, but about a year later, a donor advisor called me and said they wanted to commission a book about, his anonymous donor actually wanted to commission a book about immigration, and would I be interested? So I thought, I don't, somebody's telling me something, and maybe I ought to seriously consider it. So that was really the genesis.
Great. For those who don't have time to read the whole book, how would you summarize it?
Well, it's a long book, and so I'm not sure I could summarize it, but let me see if I can describe it. At some level, it's about legislation. So it's about the legislative process and the life and times, really, of a bill that had lots of antecedents and lots of progeny. At some level, it's a history book. A narrative history book is sort of one description or characterization of the book. Unlike a lot of narrative history books or legislative history books, however, it's not only about the lawmakers and the policymakers and the kind of big names in the process. It's really told from the perspective of nonprofit advocates, in large part Latino civil rights organizations. Some have said the hidden story here is it's really about a book about race and how race has infected immigration debates. And I guess at some level, all of those are true, but I like to think of it, Steve, as an adventure story where unexpected developments constantly occur at really every turn. And as was noted in the introduction, these were bills that were declared dead on multiple occasions and actually died on multiple occasions before being resurrected. And I guess as a last thing, I would say, it's an adventure story, not because, I have any great writing chops or anything. It's because the story itself is so powerful and so epic. And I just hope I've done it some justice.
That's great. Well, I'll ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to Michelle to start asking questions too. But, you and I and Michelle are deep in the weeds on immigration law and policy, but why should the average American care about immigration? It doesn't seem to be a top tier issue among voters. So why is it important that we discuss immigration and try to make it better?
Well, that's the answer to that is a complex one, but I guess I would say several things. One is immigration is part of who we are. It is part of our national character, and the term "nation of immigrants" is one that maybe is overused, but like lots of cliches, it's become a cliche because it's so true. Currently, I think it also says a lot. What our immigration policy says a lot about who we will become as a country. And so many have articulated the notion that immigration is an essential part of a debate about our national character and our national identity. And so I think those of us who care about our country, our values, our identity, should care about immigration. There are also practical issues, right? It has the labor market and the economy and so forth. But I think those are really the fundamental issues.
Okay. Charles, your last chapter has like 7 lessons that you think current advocates could learn from the past efforts at immigration reform. What are some of those lessons, and do you think that they could be applied today?
Well, I won't go through all 7, but I think the key one is one that many advocates and many lawmakers and many policymakers have departed from, and it's fundamentally a practical one, which is in the legislative process, you have to compromise and you have to talk to the other side. That's especially true just from a practical matter that, you know, with some rare exceptions, you need 60 votes to pass the Senate. With rare exceptions, speakers in the House who have the sole power, frankly, to schedule legislation have to be worried about their standing within their caucus. And that, you know, the extent to which I think many advocates really want to articulate a no compromise position, want to articulate what would be ideal if they were a czar or a king or an emperor, you know, I think simply aren't dealing with reality. And so that's kind of one point. A related point, particularly for pro-immigration advocates, and I've said this before, so apologies for those who have heard it. You know, in the 80s and 90s, it was the forces of restriction that had the burden of proof. That is to say, there wasn't anything like employer sanctions. There wasn't anything like the border enforcement regime we know today. So they were trying to change the status quo to impose that new enforcement regime. And frankly, they had to accept legalization as the price for that. In the current situation, it's really pro-immigration advocates who have the burden of proof. We are the ones trying to win protections for dreamers. We are the ones trying to win protections for undocumented people or farm workers. We are the ones trying to increase legal immigration, and therefore we have the burden of proof and ultimately the burden of compromise as well.
So how do we change the narrative? How do we get Americans to believe that immigration is actually good for America?
Well, if I knew that for sure, lots of things might be different. I'm not 100% sure about it, but I think therefore we have to try a number of things. The first thing that's true is that what we are doing simply hasn't worked for the last 30 plus years. Even though by many metrics, right, immigration is more popular, pro-immigrant policies like the DREAM Act are more popular, those metrics ultimately aren't definitive with respect to the legislative process. So I believe we have to try many different things. For one thing, I think to go back to the first question, or one of the first questions you asked, Steve, I think we have to figure out a way to help Americans understand, Americans who don't follow immigration, why it's in their interest for us to have a generous and humane immigration policy. Second, I think as a tiny step towards that, I think many of our current generation of advocates, for completely understandable reasons, speak about the issues from their own perspectives, often as immigrants themselves. And not that those aren't important perspectives, but frankly, those are not ones that most Americans share. So I think we have to find different voices, other voices that will speak to the vast majority of Americans, or certainly those who are persuadable. And finally, I would say, I believe the American people have a lot of compassion. I believe the American public is fundamentally a generous public, but it is also a public that is concerned about making sure that laws are enforced. And so in addition to calls for compassion and generosity, and ultimately what I think is in our economic and social interest, I think we have to at least give a nod towards the need for a more effective, humane, but still more effective enforcement system.
Michelle?
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. In 2.5 years of Zooming, I've never had a fire alarm go off before. Charles, I'm curious, to hear you take the lessons that you learned from 1986 and 1990 and tell us, first of all, if you think there's something advocates could be doing better or differently. Obviously, that's a tough question, but and for those of you in the audience who are following this issue closely, there was a new proposal that just became public yesterday between Senators Kirsten Sinema and Tom Tillis that would provide a path to legalization for dreamers in exchange for some pretty significant changes to border policy, including more barriers, more detention, an extension to something called Title 42. I'm curious, the details of that aside, how close or far do you think we are from actually being able to pass something?
That's another $1 million question. What I would say is, and I've said this before, if you start looking at these issues from the perspective of say, a betting person, and would you place a bet on immigration reform passing, you'd be, wise to always bet no, and to always bet against it, right? This is the history of this issue, that at best, reforms are enacted, once a generation, if then. So, at any given time, it's always a good bet to bet against reform. Second, before I critique the field, as it were, let me start by saying what the field has done very well. I think the pro-immigrant advocacy field performed heroically during the Trump administration, really notwithstanding enormous, negative rhetoric and at various points, really anti-immigrant actors controlling all levers of government. Ultimately, the worst effects of the Trump administration, the worst initiatives were mitigated. But to answer the question, I do think advocates could have and should be doing some things differently. As I noted earlier, I don't think we're speaking enough to the interests of centrist, persuadable people who are kind of with us, but aren't really engaged.
What would those messages sound like?
I think they would sound like, in some cases, economic messages, in some cases, really different kinds of racial messages. That is to say, lots of people, when they hear about structural racism or systemic racism or, immigration as an illustration of that, and I've written to that effect myself. So, it affects, it's also something I identify with those arguments. I don't think those are very effective public arguments. I think those are more academic. I think those are more kind of purely policy arguments, because very often I believe when people hear the immigration system is systemically racist, or this policy or that policy is racist, I think they often hear they're calling me a racist because I might support one aspect of those policies. I just think we need to be much more careful. Frankly, I think we could use more white men and women articulating these positions. And there's been kind of an empowerment ethos within the pro-immigrant advocacy movement. And I get it, right? Immigrant voices, people of color should be represented in the debate, but I don't think they should be they should always be the leading spokespeople for these issues. And there are some lessons from the past where I think that's been employed effectively. And finally, I think we have to continue to reinforce what I think is a truism, which is as our country's demographics change,
Mhm.
there is a place for white people in this country, that we are not, that demographics and people of color, demographic change and people of color in ever more powerful positions does not in fact diminish the place of people who may be concerned about those changes, but actually enriches our country in multiple ways, and is one where the children and the grandchildren of people in Middle America now will be far better off in the future with a more humane and more generous immigration policy.
With that,
Charles,
with that, Charles, we have a question from the audience that's related to that. Is, has the case really been made that immigration is good for America? Because many people are skeptical, or at least they hear stories that immigrants steal jobs from U.S. workers. So how do we convince Americans that actually immigration is in their interest?
Yeah, I think the substantive case is very strong, whether it's economic or social. I do believe, to respond to the questioner, that we don't repeat it often enough. I think typically in policy circles or advocacy circles, right, you're reaching for the next big thing or the next shiny object or the next catchy line that'll get you quoted or get you clicks. I don't think we do the basics often enough, which is to repeat that, the vast majority of economists, the vast majority of experts believe immigration is good for this country, and I don't think we lift up that storyline often enough.
Michelle?
I want to go back to actual potential reform efforts in Congress, and I'm wondering if you could share with us what you think sort of the environment or the ingredients of a deal would need to look like for something to come together, and how close or far are we from that?
Yeah, you brought up the current discussions, and you'll notice I kind of glossed over those.
Yeah, it's just the idea of the day, right?
So, was I visibly ducking and dodging? I think I think the current cinema Tillis talks at least outline a plausible deal. Similarly, what I've heard of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act and the advocacy around that bill is I can see a plausible path towards enactment. And these days, that's about as good as you can hope for. And I think now it kind of depends. It's less a structural question and more about people. Are lawmakers willing to go there, and are advocates willing to go there?
Well, maybe if you could share with the audience, in your book, you do say, and I'm not remembering the precise words, but you say, it's almost like the stars aligned of it was the right moment, it was the right people. Can you summarize a little bit of what you meant by that? And are we seeing that today?
Right. So let's go back to 1986. This was the third time around for the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And if you count its predecessors, arguably the 8th or 9th or 10th time around. The bill had been killed a couple of times before in the House. And its one-time lead sponsor, Congressman Romano Mazzoli, the late Congressman Mazzoli, who just passed away recently, had essentially been nudged out of the way of co-sponsorship of his own bill. And Judiciary Chairman Peter Rodino had sort of taken over. The bills passed both houses, but then, had passed the Senate, was on the verge of enactment in the House, and the rule was killed on the floor. And this was just days before the Congress was scheduled to adjourn. Often under normal circumstances, that would be it, right? Rules go down, bills die. That's kind of the norm in Congress. But an unlikely combination of circumstances converged. So one, there was a compromised faction, a moderate faction, if you will, of the Hispanic caucus that had been opposing the bill that decided it was time to compromise. Pro-immigrant advocacy groups that had opposed the legislation for being too tough on enforcement and insufficient on legalization, decided the time was right to compromise. And importantly, the players on the other side of the bills, Senator Simpson, notably, decided it was time to compromise. And then there was this other thing that happened, which was the introduction of an innovation, as it were. One of the stumbling blocks to the bill had been the notion of a guest worker program for agriculture, highly controversial, opposed by labor, opposed by civil rights groups, obviously supported by agriculture. And the United Farm Workers and grow representatives, led by Congressman Berman and Schumer, and then Congressman Panetta, fashioned a compromise that ultimately both at one level threatened the bill, but ultimately carried the bill past the finish line. So I think it's willingness to compromise on both sides, as well as a policy innovation were the key factors.
And there was another factor too, and that was that Congress stayed in session longer than anticipated because Reagan had to go negotiate an arms deal and called Congress back into session. So I think, that was sort of fortuitous and lucky. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been enough time to negotiate these compromises.
Indeed, that was the first time I heard the name Reykjavik, which is where the summit was being held. So yes, it's a good point, Steve.
Michelle, go ahead.
I think I was going to ask you what you're describing, that willingness to compromise. Can you say a little bit more about where that desire came from? Sort of what was the straw that broke the camel's back? And are you seeing anyone in the pro-immigrant rights movement today who is willing to go there?
Well, that second one is a lot tougher than the first, but just to set the scene, Latino advocates and our allies had been opposing the legislation, as I said quickly earlier, for being insufficiently generous, basically. And what we saw was several things happening. One, the bill kept getting better. So we kept offering and pushing for amendments, and we were winning those amendments. And Senator Simpson on the other side, who was a really tough opponent, was sending signals that he was willing to compromise. So that was one. So there was an opportunity.
Yeah.
Having somebody like Peter Rodino in the chair also made a big difference. Mr. Rodino was an icon in the civil rights community. He was an icon among progressives. He had led the successful impeachment of President Nixon in the House. There was a sense that this was someone whom we could trust. And then finally, we also saw some storm clouds on the horizon. We were being told that if we kept on being obstructionist, that things would get worse, not better. And so there was a quote unquote, window of opportunity that was opened. And luckily we had leaders, my former boss, Raul Seguirre, Congressman Esteban Torres from California, who were willing to pursue compromise aggressively. Is that available today? Well, what I would say is if you had looked at the press articles from 30 years ago, you would have said, these guys are not going to compromise. We weren't negotiating in the press. We weren't, any more than you would expect people to be doing that now.
That's a great point.
So I do think there are some clues you can see. So there have been, in the recent articles, a number of people have been talking about being open or being encouraged or supporting the notion of talks, right? So they're not locking themselves into necessarily supporting the final deal, but are being very encouraging about negotiations. And that's not necessarily something one would have expected. And as the ones who potentially have the most to lose, groups, human rights groups, those really whose first interest is asylum,
working at the border,
protecting the asylum system. They've also been more reticent than one would expect, right? So what I've seen in the press are, well, the details matter, or the devil's in the details, or we're going to withhold judgment. I think for some of them, it's going to be very difficult to go all out in opposition if it turns out that this is a deal that's going to provide relief for 2 million dreamers.
Yeah. Let me pick up on two aspects of that, Charles. One is I want to pick up on your word trust. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was more trust among congressmen to work out compromises. In this hyper polarized Congress, do you think that makes it harder? Do members of Congress, are they willing to trust people on the opposite side to be willing to compromise?
Well, I would note, first of all, just going outside of immigration, there have been some somewhat surprising bipartisan deals done recently, right? There's a bipartisan infrastructure bill. There was a bipartisan deal on guns. There was a bipartisan deal on marriage equality. There have been some
the Electoral Count Act that could potentially pass,
potentially
criminal justice reform
right. in the end of the Trump administration. So some people are trusting some other people. That doesn't mean most people are engaged in that, but you don't need most. You just need 60 in the Senate. And so, I'm not in those rooms. I may be hearing some secondhand characterizations of what's happening in those rooms, but the basis for what I understand is currently being discussed is a Cornyn-Sinema bill. That's from Senator Cornyn, Republican from Texas, and Senator Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona, right? They trust each other enough to introduce a bill together. And so, I think we won't know until after the fact. But again, I would repeat that at least the chances of enactment of something are plausible.
A similar related question came in from one of the viewers. What are the basic outlines of a possible deal? For example, how should we deal with asylum seekers and people who are in the country illegally? I mean, you sort of have answered that, but maybe you could elaborate on what you think a possible compromise might look like.
Well, first of all, let me just make clear I'm speaking for myself only, and not any of my affiliations. Second, I will turn the question around a little bit. I hesitate to say what should be in the deal, and would prefer to say what I think might be in a deal that could be enacted. So the first is some variant of Senator Tillis's so-called Succeed Act, which is a form of a DREAM Act, as it were, with a long and some would say tortured path towards permanent status for a quite significant number of dreamers. The second would be, as the GOP has argued for, is stronger border enforcement. And as an element of that, some asylum system reforms. It seems to me that many of those concepts are embodied in the Cornyn-Sinema bill. Many of those concepts are frankly embodied in the Biden administration's asylum rule. And so some notion of faster processing, and so we don't have these 3 to 5 year delays, some giving Republicans some comfort to address what they call, I think somewhat exaggeratedly, catch and release, and a pro-asylum version of something that could be done is, and I think the administration is committed to this, which is more legal services for asylum applicants. And I think the research on that is quite strong, that people who are represented both do better in the system, which makes total sense, but they're also much more likely to show up for their hearings. So I think it has both a good government, good public policy type benefit, as well as should give some comfort to people who are concerned about people absconding once they enter the U.S.
Michelle, let me ask you a question. What is it like to cover immigration these days?
It's very busy, Steve. It's interesting. You know, I think we chatted about this a little bit yesterday. When people think about immigration, they think about these, you know, grand compromises. But what I'm actually doing day to day is mostly not writing about Congress, because for the most part, Congress is not doing anything about immigration. And instead, I'm writing about ways that the immigration system is sort of breaking down across the board. You know, that's everywhere from the border when they're having trouble managing the numbers of people, to the way that we're handling refugees or setting up a system to welcome Ukrainians into this country. I write about businesses and their dealings with the immigration system. I write about international students. So it really expands the gamut, and it's tons of fun.
And I think that's one of the general problems with our immigration system, is we have not had major changes since the Immigration Act of 1990, over 30 years ago. And so our system is not built for the realities of today. And I think that USCIS is, you know, trying to dig itself out of a large hole. They need more adjudicators, they need more money. And I think that, you know, regular people who are trying to get visa appointments overseas, or trying to extend or change their statuses in the United States, are very upset with the current bureaucracy that they have to deal with. And it makes it harder, I think, to try to enact significant reforms when the current system is so broken. And you've written about that kind of thing, Michelle.
I think that's totally right. And you're right to sort of separate it into two distinct issues. I think the big broader issue is that the visa categories that we are working with today just in some ways make no sense. I mean, if you were to sit and write down an immigration system on paper, this is not the one you'd come up with. And I think, you know, one basic example that I think students would relate to is that, for example, if you apply for a student visa to come to the US, you have to pledge that you are not going to stay. Now, does that make any sense? Probably not, but it's what the rules are. And I think you're right that apart from the fact that these categories are totally antiquated, that we've seen the system just totally break down in the last few years. You know, partially because we've just seen like major staff exoduses under the Trump administration and during the pandemic, and you know, consulates around the world basically shut down during the pandemic. There are a couple of places that are still not offering visa appointments. So it's hard to talk about immigration when the current system is just like totally not functioning.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I agree with both of you, but you know, there were also really adverse, negative policy shifts in the Trump administration that, frankly, will take some time to unwind. Right, so-called extreme vetting, where you have to adjudicate and re-adjudicate petitions over and over again. Right, people who've been vetted multiple times have to be vetted yet again.
Right.
There are also these tiny little things, right? That, I mean, INS, the legacy INS, now USCIS, was always known to be an inefficient agency, and to some extent, when it was combined with other agencies to become part of DHS, those problems remain. So, you know, and I guess the last thing I'd say is these are broad structural problems that, you know, one would hope could be dealt with separately. And I think the Biden administration is making some reasonable progress. But again, it's on top of the backlogs that Steve, you described, the challenges that Michelle, you described, as well as real, you know, policy roadblocks that were deliberately placed in the way of immigration systems that weren't functioning all that smoothly.
Right. And I think it's worth emphasizing, Charles, like, we're not talking huge. I mean, I think when people think of the Trump administration's policies, they think of things like the travel ban, but some of the things that were the most effective, I'll try to come up with just a couple examples that sound silly, but were really huge. For example, in one case, they required applicants who had already submitted fingerprints that if they wanted to renew an application, they had to submit a fresh round of fingerprints. But guess what? During COVID, the fingerprinting sites closed. And so it created this huge backup. And suddenly people were losing their work permits and their visas. And, so it really, really tiny changes had these really outsized effects.
Right, particularly cumulatively, right?
Yes.
Because those weren't happening in isolation.
Exactly.
Let me go back to one of your points, Michelle, about our antiquated categories. Here's a question from the audience. We have what are called per country caps, where every country is treated identically in terms of how many people from that country can enter the United States, even if they're from a small country like Monaco or Liechtenstein, or a huge country like China or India. As a consequence, there are long backlogs for people, particularly from countries like China and India and Mexico. And there are efforts being made to remove that per country cap. Indeed, the House of Representatives this week is going to be voting on a bill called the Eagle Act that would, over 9 years, sort of phase out these per country caps. So I think Congress recognizes that we need to change our system. And if we can't do it in a comprehensive way through one big bill, maybe we can do it in smaller ways, such as the Eagle Act. The question is, even if the House passes the Eagle Act this week, do you think that bill in particular has any chance of being taken up and passed by the Senate anytime soon?
I will not pretend to know the answer to that question. I will say the Senate has 3 weeks to pass that. And if not, we start over. We start the clock. And so I think, as Charles said before, the chances of anything passing are less likely than more likely.
Yeah, I agree with that, unfortunately, but you never know. A question going back to the dysfunction of our current system, audience member asks, do you think part of the dysfunction has to do with different functions of the immigration system being distributed across different agencies, such as the Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Labor? This has been one of my big points over my career, is the fact that on environmental issues, we've got an Environmental Protection Agency. On veterans issues, we've got a Veterans Administration. But we don't have one agency dealing with all aspects of immigration. And I wish Congress would enact some cabinet level immigration agency. I think that would take a lot of the dysfunction. Now, it would not resolve all the problems, certainly not resolve them immediately, but I think that is one structural change that Congress should take up. And I wonder if you, Charles, or you, Michelle, have any comments on that.
I'm curious what Charles has to say.
Yeah, I remember back in the day when advocates wanted to break INS up into 2 different agencies, right? And the idea was that it was an agency that was too dominated by enforcement and where the service functions were neglected. I think there was some truth to that. Some would argue there's still some truth to that in the context of a DHS. I'm reticent to think in terms of, if I were czar, what would I do? I think it'd be great to have a single agency. I suspect it's not in the cards.
Oh, well, we can always hope. So another question from an audience member: has immigration always been a political talking point for politicians, or has it grown over the last 30 years? Charles?
Well, it has always been a talking point for politicians. And, one need only go back to the, say, turn of the century and the beginning with the Chinese exclusion acts and the national origins quotas. I think it's ebbed and flowed to some extent with changing demographics, with other kinds of circumstances, but at one level, among some groups at least, it's always been a hot button issue. And how could it not be? This really does go to the question of our fundamental identity as a country, as I noted earlier. And I think it should be a topic of national debate. One wishes that one could talk about demographics without getting too far into what I believe is often really heavily racialized debates. But that's not the times we live in. So I think we have to confront those issues.
Do you think the Biden administration is not doing enough to talk about the benefits of immigration? It seems like they really want to shy away from discussing any immigration because it just is a political morass.
Yeah, this has been a standard frustration of immigration advocates for a long time. I think, as I was saying earlier, we believe the case is strong. And we believe, frankly, also that this is one case where good policy is good politics. And yet the conventional wisdom among Democratic politicians and Democratic political consultants and media gurus and such is that immigration is a political loser. And even if it's not often stated, it's pretty clear that that's how a lot of Democrats tend to act. As a evidence against that, I think, is just think back to how DACA and the DACA announcement in 2012 really improved President Obama's standing, not just in the Latino community, but frankly didn't hurt him anywhere else. But it does require leaning in. It does require being confident about a position. And I don't think we have evidence that the Biden administration is there yet.
Michelle, any questions you want? I've got several questions from the audience.
Let's keep going with the audience.
Okay, great.
In. Yeah.
One question from the audience is, how do we motivate our legislators to understand that they need to compromise and pass immigration legislation?
Well, the kind of call to action question always comes up in these discussions, and I think it's an appropriate one. In advocacy circles these days, at least for the last, I would say, 15 years, as we've gravitated towards more techie solutions, more social media solutions, more being pushed by funders to generate metrics, clicks and bodies at a demonstration, I think we've often lost the human element. And I believe that most legislators, notwithstanding their caricatures, are actually human beings, and they kind of act like human beings. And often the most effective lobbying is meeting with them, or if you can't meet with them, meeting with their staff and telling your story and telling why you think as a constituent a legislator ought to do this or that. I think the growers and farm workers in the current cycle have been very effective lobbyists in pushing the Farm Workforce Modernization Act to the place it's been. I think business has done an enormous amount to be supportive of that as well. I think Dreamers have often been their own best advocates, right, as they tell their stories about the circumstances of how they've come to this country and why they want a permanent solution so they can continue to contribute to the country. So I would say, go back to the basics, talk to your legislator.
Yeah. Another question that comes in from an audience member, and that is, migration doesn't affect just the United States. And there are many reasons why people from other countries in Central America, South America, Cuba, Africa, feel that they either have to come to the United States or want to come to the United States. To what extent should we be focusing more on regional or multilateral agreements to try to manage immigration better?
Michelle, do you have views on that?
That audience member might be, are you working for the Biden administration? That is exactly at least the rhetoric we've seen coming out of the Biden administration. And I don't have an opinion on whether it's a good idea, but it's probably one that deserves a little bit more exploration. I think for a lot of people, uh, in a lot of cases we've seen in the last year, especially, you're totally right. People coming to the US because they're feeling desperate and they have no options. And in a lot of cases, you're seeing, for example, Venezuelans who've been out of Venezuela for 4 or 5 years, living in Ecuador, living in Colombia, living in Peru, and finding that they really just can't make ends meet there because those economies were, slower to recover from COVID. In particular places in Peru, there's been a lot of xenophobia against Venezuelans. And so I think, it's a point of desperation where people are coming here. But if we could create sort of other places for them to feel safe and to feel like they can, actually make a livelihood, then that's definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, I agree with that. Particularly with climate change, where the global south is going to warm. And so it's not just there are poor economies there, but also that likely to be more affected by climate change, which does induce migration. I'm one of those guys who was always kind of a domestic guy, didn't really focus very much on the international dimensions of these issues. I think we're not going to have a choice much longer.
I think that's
But
right.
here I think is the problem. It's no panacea, right? Foreign aid ain't more popular than immigration is. Implementing development in some of these countries, some of which are failed states or nearly failed states, trying to help them establish a rule of law. I mean, those are big nuts to crack as well. So,
and interestingly, there's a researcher named Michael Clemens who's found that, in some of these cases where you're looking at a country that's, extremely poor, take Honduras or Haiti, and you make people ever so slightly better off, but not to the point where they're living comfortable lives, that actually increases the chance that they want to leave because they actually now have the means to be able to leave also.
Yeah,
indeed.
And here at Cornell, with the Migrations Initiative, we've been doing some of that cross-country research on climate change. For example, we did an interesting research report on how temperature rise in Central America has affected the weather there, made it drier, and how that's also, you can sort of see a direct correlation of that and migration patterns from Central American countries. So we have just a few more minutes left. Charles, what would you want people to take away from this webinar? What do you want them to go out and do, having heard you speak?
I would just say get engaged, even if people don't agree with the specifics of what I've been saying. I think this is an issue that too often is everybody's second or third or fourth priority. And you need good horses, right? If you're going to get stuff done in Congress, if you're going to get stuff done even in administration, you need champions. You need people who care about it. You need people who are going to work late, who are going to not leave any stone unturned. I think that's part of the lesson of what's in the book. I hesitate to say this at this time of where we're all supposed to be leading balanced, healthy lives, but we're in the change the world business, and I've never seen anybody change the world working 35 hours a week. So I just think you gotta get engaged. I also think because gridlock is what characterizes this area of policy and has for decades, right? This isn't a new thing. It's actually people who are willing to break with orthodoxy, who are willing to go against the conventional wisdom that often turn out to be the signal players that catalyze change. And so, I would say, have some guts, be willing to push against orthodoxy, even though that may come with some adverse effects, because if you don't, you're just accepting gridlock.
Mhm. Michelle, do you have anything you want to add to that from your perspective as a reporter on this issue?
I think I probably shouldn't advise advocacy strategy, but really interesting what Charles said.
Mhm. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. Charles's book is a great book, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all sorts of local bookstores. And it ties in with what we're doing at the Cornell Law School. We have an immigration policy and research program that Charles is involved with, and we really appreciate his insights. We're going to be continuing this conversation by having a conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. on Friday, February 24th. That will be a hybrid conference that will allow people from around the country to participate virtually, as well as those in the Washington, D.C. area who want to participate in person. So we'll be sending out save the dates notice for that. And is there anything else that Charles or Michelle you want to add before we sign off?
I would love to quickly say, where I don't want to advocate on strategy, I would say, think about, if you are involved in an immigration clinic at the law school or know friends who are going through a tough time with the immigration system, one immediate thing you can do is reach out to a reporter. we always want to tell your stories, and I think they really do influence conversation.
And in that regard, I would just simply say, yeah, building on that, just getting involved with immigrants on a direct basis, teaching them English as a second language. Ithaca Welcomes Refugees network. We do have a lot of immigration clinics at Cornell Law School, and it educates both the law students and their clients about the problems and inefficiencies of our immigration system. So there's a lot that people can do on a personal level just to get to know immigrants better and understand that they're just as human as everyone else. Charles, I think I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I agree with what you said, Steve, and I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity and thank Cornell. I'm not someone who had a particularly distinguished academic career, and I haven't spent a lot of time in the Ivy Leagues, and it's really quite remarkable what level of intellectual resources as well as other resources are available to students here. So it's really a treasure that you have here, Steve.
We're glad to do it, and glad that we had such an informative webinar with two excellent speakers. So with that, we'll sign off and tell your friends about this webinar, and stay tuned for our conference in DC on February 24th. And with that, we're done for today. Thank you.
Okay, we're done.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.